Okay, I think we're live. Thanks everybody for joining us. If you're, just getting in, getting organized, it's Steve and Jose again from Layer 7. We've got Francois Lascelles, our chief architect, as our guest today, and we're excited. This is the first Tech Talk back from the summer break. We're going to talk about OAuth and kind of sort of answer the question of, are there some fundamental security flaws around the OAuth protocol? And as you guys are getting into the stream and getting organized, I just want to explain, if you've never been here before, this is a live discussion, a live Q&A. The idea is to give you guys a chance to ask some questions to an expert and have those questions answered live. So there's a couple of ways you can ask your questions. You can chat them in if you're at the layer7.com/live. You can see you're watching the video and there's a chat beside there. You can just simply put your questions in there. And we'll try to get them in chronological order. Sometimes they come in spurts, so we'll try to get to your question as soon as we can. You can simply tweet them with the hashtag Layer7Live. And if you have a more kind of technical or more advanced or complicated question, or if you can't stick with us for the whole duration and wait for your question to be answered, you can always email them in to techtalk@layer7.com. So, and then we'll get back to you somehow sometime soon through email. And I think I'm just going to let Francois introduce the topic and say welcome. Great.
Take a look at the live chat because I can't look at it. To refresh the page.
No audio for Franco.
One sec, Franco. We need to make sure your audio is coming through.
Sorry, Francois. Sorry, everybody on the line. There's no sound from Francois. We're just gonna just fix that. Sorry, Francois. And sorry, everybody. We've got quite a few people waiting. But feel free to get those questions in, and we'll get them organized while Jose fixes the sound for Franco.
Yes.
Yes.
Am I on now?
Not quite.
Okay.
Could it be him muting himself?
No, because I can hear him.
Right. Yeah. Of course.
Speak for a second, Franco.
You hear me now? Check.
Okay,
Audio
it's good
is
now.
good now. Okay, thanks everybody.
Okay, awesome. So
different voices for different people. Sometimes you can't hear them.
Sorry about that, guys.
Let's try to pick up on the time lost here. I'm just going to, I think that the reason this topic is important is that, our digital life and our interaction with information in general is scattered a whole bunch of different services. And the pattern through which you authorize two service providers effectively to interact on your behalf is only going to get even more important in the future. So there's been some things that happen, some hacks that were very popularized, and some of the vulnerabilities that were identified were somehow associated with OAuth, and that's why I want to find out, how should you use OAuth? Even if OAuth, the finger was pointed wrongly at OAuth, how can you use OAuth in a way that you avoid these type of things? And let's make sure that we learn from that. So let me just put a few things right off the bat on the table. So, for example, use SSL, right? Use a secure channel when you're using OAuth. Take sufficient precaution to secure shared secrets. For example, don't pass access tokens and query parameters if you can avoid it, right? It just lends itself to it being ended up rendered on web pages or being in log files and things like that. Input sanitization for all parameters in a handshake or when consulting an API that lets you control tokens in general. Limit the session lifespan, right? A token should be valid for years if there's anything sensitive that you can get from it. And then lastly, limit scope associated to sessions. So if there's a way to restrict what you can do based on a specific token, you should do that. So none of this stuff is specific to OAuth, right? This is just thing that applies whether or not you're using OAuth. Like if you're using web, you would have to worry about the same kind of stuff for example, how you would handle sessions and how cookies are kept confidential, things like that. So those are fundamental things, and I think that we're going to start taking questions. There are also some things that we should particularly be careful about when you're doing OAuth, and I'm hoping we're going to get to some of those. And the last thing before we jump to the first question, people always ask me what they should look for, and if you're interested in some reading, a couple of references that I would recommend is the security considerations section of the OAuth core spec. And the other one that I think is a good source of information is the RFC 6819, called OAuth 2 Threat Models and Security Considerations. So, Steve, I think we can jump right in and start taking questions.
Sure, yeah. We appreciate everybody getting a couple of questions in early. We're just going to go right off the top with going head on and saying, answer the question, is OAuth 2.0, is it less secure than OAuth 1.0?
Okay, yeah, that's a good one to start with. So OAuth 1 has the concept of HMAC signatures, but mostly, the reason for that to be was to make it so that you didn't have to use SSL. And like I said in the intro, I think that using SSL is important, and it provides more security than just doing signatures not over SSL. And if you are going over SSL, then those signatures, just increase the complexity on the client side, and they tend to be interrupt nightmares. So I would say OAuth 2 is at least as secure as OAuth 1, if not more. And you should use SSL anyway because you want to protect yourself from things like man in the middle. So I think that proper server-side verification is important. OAuth 2 definitely not less secure than OAuth 1.
Okay. We've got our first kind of comment through the chat, through the live chat. OAuth has these weaknesses: weak basic authentication, spoofed access tokens, phishing, DOS, resource exhaustion. How do you ensure security measures to circumvent these? Let me see if I can catch his name.
Yeah, where did that come from? That's a good question. So a lot of the
that's Ravi.
Sorry, Abby?
Sorry, his name's Ravi. Thanks for the question, Ravi.
Yeah. No, this is very good. So weak basic authentication. The spec actually doesn't say how you do authentication. So that's really not something that you're limited by from using OAuth as a specification. I think that the same you can authenticate in any way that you want, and OAuth still fits in, right? Maybe if you have an authentication model that has a challenge response type of a complicated flow, OAuth maybe needs to be adjusted a little bit to support that. But just in general, it doesn't specify exactly how you do authentication. So there's options. Spoofed access tokens. I'm not sure what you mean by spoofed access tokens. I think that certainly you have to be careful that the token itself is not compromised, but you can't just spoof a token, right? You need the token. Usually, it's just like a random generated string that has to be recognized on the server side. Phishing is the big one. So let's jump right into phishing, right? And I think that a lot of what has gone wrong in some service providers' OAuth implementation was the fact that they were not protecting themselves properly from phishing attacks. Phishing attacks is very often, associated with OAuth, but any authorization protocol doesn't matter, what standard it's based on. If there's a redirection, there's the risk that basically a token, if it's passed through a redirection, and the redirection is going towards an attacker, then you get a phishing attack, and that's what we've seen a lot of people exploiting OAuth and doing that. But the thing is that getting back to the basic security considerations that are defined as part of the OAuth specification, the validation of the redirect URIs is pretty fundamental, right? You should have redirect URIs that are registered and that's strictly enforced on the authorization server, so that if an attacker is trying to do a phishing attack, they won't be able to get redirected back to their endpoint because that endpoint will not be registered. And if they're trying to impersonate a legitimate application, they need to be able to redirect that back to their endpoint. They won't be able to do that if you're doing that properly. Phishing, DOS, resource exhaustion, same thing that applies to anything on the web, really. You need to do some proper rate limiting. You need to do some proper rate limiting around token issuing as much as anything else. So I think that's really basic. There's a lot of questions coming in fast here.
There are a lot of questions coming in through the chat, and comments too. So so Francois, I'm going to try to just organize them as best I can.
Sure.
You're probably seeing them from your view in just one single stream, but I'll try to break them up a little bit.
I'm just going to pick one off that I see coming down the stream here. You talk about SSL. Do you have opinions on rumors that NSA has access to SSL? It's not as bad as that. And of course, there's a lot of conspiracy theories, but there's a rumor that there's a random number generation cipher that has been indeed, there could be a backdoor. So you should avoid using that algorithm when you expose an SSL endpoint or when you're doing a handshake on the client side. But then this has been known for a long time, and by default we've deselected that particular cipher from our product as early as 3 years ago. So I would say nothing new there, but it's a good thing to think about it.
Okay. Can we move on to the sort of question and comment from Brock?
Brock, I think the RFCs you referenced show that security specialist is hard and that security specialists should be writing this type of code, not average developers. Yeah, Brock, I think that security and threat protection in general, in the end, should be the responsibility of everybody, right? Everybody should be security aware and security conscious. But you're right. I mean, we're talking about session management. We're talking about session issuing and token issuing and in some cases federation. And we're talking about controlling who has access to what. So yes, it is a very security matter. When you say that it shouldn't be the average developer that should be coding that, well, I mean, obviously I have a bias because I've worked at Layer 7 Technologies, but I would argue you shouldn't code that at all, right? You should use specialized infrastructure that has already coded it for you, and you should decouple that kind of security responsibilities from the actual API implementation, right? Your actual API should focus on the business logic and the access control that through which your API is controlled should be decoupled from the actual API implementation. Okay, going down, are we talking to Lance's question next, Stephen?
Yes, I think we should do Lance. I just want to mention thanks for the questions from Brock and others. And if you're on the line or in the stream and you sent in an email question, we're going to get to those as soon as we catch up to the live ones. So if we don't get another one after Lance, then we're going to go to the email questions from VJ and Rich. So hopefully you guys are on the line, and we'll get to you guys next. And then we had one from Twitter that we'll address. Okay.
Good. Lance Ben writes, for deployment considerations, should an enterprise use a central authorization server? I don't know that is necessarily a security-driven decision. The actual authorization server, whether you have multiple instances, for example, across regions, maybe each region can have its own authorization server. That's fine. There's ways to coordinate token issuing across different regions, across different deployments, and you can have multiple instances of authorization servers and still have a centralized or distributed token management layer that makes it possible that in one region a token is issued, and in another region it can be validated. So I think that you can do that, and whether or not you choose to do that, it is also about how does that fit your architecture. You should look at performance, but there are ways to do that securely. So I think it's a valid pattern.
We got another one through the stream. We might as well keep going. From Brian, what are the most common attacks that you have seen in Layer 7 OAuth deployments? Good question.
What are the most common attacks that you have seen in Layer 7 OAuth deployments? Yeah, that's a good question. We're certainly focused on preparing to protect people from a lot of the attacks that we're talking about. So we're certainly focused on, for example, making sure that there's no way to circumvent a URI, a redirect URI validation. We're taking care of making sure that, from a performance perspective, you can't overwhelm the authorization server. We're making sure that, you're, we're obfuscating internal tokens by doing some brokering at the edge. So this is what we're proactively protecting against, and I don't know that I can talk about any specific attacks on the Layer 7 specific OAuth implementation, but I can certainly report that we're doing everything to make it as secure as possible.
Okay, moving right along from Jeff.
Yeah.
Can you give an overview of what happened regarding Twitter OAuth, and if I should be worried? How can I mitigate this if it happens in my organization?
Yeah. Okay. So that's coming from Jeff. So in the case of Twitter OAuth, one of the issues was that the client secret was compromised. So the client has its own secret that allows itself to be identified at runtime by an authorization server. And that's something that, obviously you should distinguish. There's two things, right? There's confidential clients and there's public clients. Confidential clients, according to the OAuth specification, are clients that can keep their secret confidential, and public clients can't. So if you take, for example, an application, a mobile application on a public app store, that should be considered a public client, because if you embed in that a secret, it could probably be reverse engineered. And what happens is that very often when people implement OAuth, they're trying to make clients that should not be considered confidential. They try to make it confidential, right? They try to obfuscate something in the application that's going to make it possible for the application to be authenticated at runtime. And sure enough, at some point, that gets broken. So you should always, in an OAuth handshake, have either a user authentication or a user consent step. And sometimes what people end up doing is that in the interest of better user experience, if there's a redirect-based handshake, and as a user, I do express consent that yes, application foo can access this API on my behalf. I've been authenticated. I authorize that. And then next time I'm redirected back because maybe there's a new handshake that's needed, the authorization server is going to remember that decision and is going to bypass it. So I'm like redirected back without being aware that anything even happened. And so if you can trick an authorization server by presenting a secret that shouldn't have been secret, and then you bypass that user consent step, you can effectively get an OAuth token that was not intended for you. So I think that's basically was the crux of the issue with Twitter OAuth.
Okay, I'm just going to read out a comment. We've got in the stream. We've got our VP of Client Services, Matt McClarty, and he made a comment as well. Thanks, Matt. Addressing Brian's question. So I guess was what were the OAuth threats that you encounter in the field? We work with clients to protect against many of the attacks discussed, but clients never disclose attacks, and if they did, we couldn't disclose them here. So thanks, Matt, for helping us reach out to Brian and answer that question. So we're just going to move right along because we've got lots of questions in the queue. The next one, I'm not sure what your name is, but it's T. LaFam maybe. In my opinion, I don't feel comfortable that the refresh tokens are a long life token. Can you comment on this as to why there is a need to have this token long life, I think?
Yeah.
Why is it designed like that in the first place?
Right. So first of all, the refresh token is optional. You don't have to use it, and you as a provider control how long a refresh token should exist. And basically, the refresh token, the way that I see the refresh token is that it's an alternative to. So for example, if I'm a user and I'm using a mobile application, I don't want to have to provide my credentials all the time because that token is becoming invalid after 15 minutes, right? So the refresh token is a workaround, not a workaround, but it's an alternative to involving the user into another handshake. So you have a handshake that bypasses the user. If you're not comfortable with that, it means that you're not comfortable with a long-lived authentication context. But you have to strike the right balance between user experience and how long do you want these sessions to live. The advantage of having both an access token and a refresh token is that each access token that you're using live can have a short lifespan, and that means that if any of those tokens are compromised, you got a reduced opportunity to exploit it. And by having that secondary token, which is used less frequently, you know, it has a longer lifespan, you kind of like restore that balance. So really, you don't have to use it if you don't think it's required. If it's okay for a user to be prompted for authentication the way that your application works, and if you think that's acceptable from a user experience, go for it, and just don't worry about refresh tokens.
Okay. Hopefully that answers your question, and you can always re-chat if we didn't quite address exactly what it was you're looking for. Bob, another question: Can an OAuth token be used an intermediary within an enterprise planning to migrate several applications from using one authentication token to another? Sorry, I stumbled on that a couple times. Hope you got that.
Can an OAuth token be used an intermediary within the enterprise planning to migrate several applications from using one application to another? I don't quite understand. I think maybe you're saying, is it okay for an access token to be used across multiple applications? I would say yes, that's acceptable as long as these applications are in the same domain, you know, from a security perspective, as long as they're not across multiple domains. So you're saying within an enterprise planning to migrate several applications, if these applications are all within your domain, then yes, it's okay to effectively share the access token across these applications. Again, these applications might not be responsible for validating those tokens in the first place because presumably you've got infrastructure in front of it that takes care of that decouple from your applications.
Okay.
There's another question from Brock here,
yeah,
too.
And comment.
Brock is talking about the HAWK protocol as an alternative to OAuth. No, I'm not comfortable commenting on that. I don't know enough about HAWK to describe, you know, how it's it differs, or they're maybe better or worse in OAuth, or specifically around security. I'm not sure about Hawk. And Brock also reminds people that you should be able to revoke tokens. Yes, that's a very important point. I completely agree. I think that it also talks about scope. You know, if you have a service that have different levels of authorization, you should make it easy for your users to adjust the scope over time, to make it easy for those users to track those permissions over time, right? I mean, sometimes you go back into the user interface or the portal for, let's say, Twitter, and you see all these applications that are authorized. You know, that concept. I think that it's really essential to make it transparent to the user and put the user in control as much as possible.
Okay. We've got a new question from Warren. So, what sort of information can you typically store in an OAuth token? Is it good practice to store authorization mapping in the token itself, provided this information is signed and the token encrypted?
Yeah. So, what sort of information? Really, it could be anything you want, right? When you issue a token, you have at that moment authenticated a user, potentially authenticated an application, so you can remember that information, right? Who was the user? Who was the application? Maybe at that time you look up, identity attributes, because you've got the user context, and maybe you've got some specific things that are important to store as part of this section. So that all makes sense. But your question is more about, you know, is it okay to store that information in the token, right? There's nothing about the OAuth specification that says what the token needs to be itself, right? It's not a token format in the sense that, like SAML is. The token is meant to be opaque. So if you choose to embed that information in the token, sign it and encrypt it so that you don't have to store that state on the server side, that's one approach. I don't actually see a lot of people doing that at the moment. It seems that the trend is more towards tokens that are completely opaque and that point to a session in a session management layer, which itself contains the information that you mentioned. The other thing is that, you know, I guess you've got to weigh the performance as well, right? On one hand, you have to verify signature and maybe decrypt the token. On the other hand, you have to manage that information and make sure it's distributed and it's fresh. Yeah, but the other thing is that the previous question was about revoking tokens. So obviously, if you're not storing state on the server side, you're not going to be able to revoke tokens. So from a security perspective, I like better the approach where you're just using opaque tokens that point to a session.
Okay, the questions are actually really piling up. So thanks for all the questions. This is great. This is exactly what we're looking for. It looks like Bob wants to kind of reiterate his question. So he says, my question was regarding migrating to a new authentication provider used by several applications. For example, if we have a bunch of applications using Kerberos and want to bring them to use SM session. Oh,
okay. Yeah, so and that's what I meant by token brokering, right? So yeah, it's a very common pattern for us, and the ability to, again, during a handshake, you have the authentication context of an end user, and you can get a Kerberos ticket issued, or actually, if you remember the authentication context using constrained delegation, you can issue a token even at runtime based on an incoming OAuth token. So yeah, I think that the ability to reconcile different identity domains is something that it maybe is not specific to OAuth, but certainly, using an authorization server that has adapters to all of these identity systems, it is definitely the kind of infrastructure you need for that solution.
Okay, moving down the list to Mark. For organizations that use the Layer 7 gateway to protect their services and APIs, what should we be telling our developers, and how do we educate them to write APIs that decouple the security?
Yeah, I think that you need to make them aware that it's available to them. You need to also obviously make it clear that this is something that they don't need to take on as part of their implementation. I think that you should be telling them that that the scope of the API doesn't need to include the actual authentication of users or issuing of tokens. That they can safely assume that it's taken care of in front of them, and that if they do need identity context as part of the actual execution of the API, there's a number of different ways that you can pass that information downstream to a trusted backend, whether it's in a header or a token, right? So that can be done. So that's what I would tell them.
Okay, great.
So OAuth was I think we talked about
can be generated as an intermediary based off of Kerberos token too.
Yep.
I think he means as well.
Yeah, we covered that, but certainly, an OAuth token can be there and be brokered between that token and a Kerberos token. So yes, this is a valid pattern.
Okay, and then Jeff asks, is there a secure way to authenticate a mobile app while in the process of acquiring the access token or authentication C?
Yeah,
I'm not sure if there's something missing off the end of that, but
I think Jeff is referring to the fact that a mobile application is typically a public application as opposed to confidential.
Right.
And hence, it is difficult to authenticate an application when it's a mobile application. There are solutions that through which you can provision something to an application after it's been pulled from an app store, and Layer 7 certainly is involved in providing solutions for that. For example, if you look at the mobile access gateway, we provision PKI to an application after it's been installed on a device as part of a device registration step, and that allows us to have a higher degree of confidence that the application that is involved in the OAuth handshake is who it is, basically. Going down the list, Stephen, Jeff, is mutual auth, SSL, and OAuth enough to protect an API call from a mobile app? Mutual authentication, so mutual SSL by itself is very secure, right? And OAuth, I think OAuth has a role to play if you're calling an API. I don't know if I would say that that's sufficient. Yes, if you use that as the base of securing your API, I think that's good. That's good enough to control access to the API. But there's of course more to security than just controlling access. You have to also address things like threat protection, and you have to do a lot of input sanitization, no matter regardless of whether or not you're doing SSL mutual. But yeah, I think it's definitely a strong base for your security. And then I'm just going to continue down the list. Steven, sounds like we're getting a lot here, and I noticed it's 9:35.
There's also a little bit of discussion going on throughout the stream, which I'll just leave and just stick with the specific questions.
Okay. So should I answer private chat question? How far is that different from basic auth? Actually, OAuth 2 access token. Ultimate virus as a header with the server, has to validate. Yeah, sure, that's correct. But when you're doing basic auth, it assumes that you always have access to the password, right? And it's kind of an anti-pattern to remembering a user's password on an application. You shouldn't do that. And if you need to call an API over time and you do that on behalf of the user, it's better practice to have a token that points to that user as opposed to having the password of that user, especially in third-party API calls. That makes a lot of sense. And just in general, right? I mean, the implications of a token being compromised, if the token is valid for 15 minutes, is much lower than a password being compromised. So that's another reason for using tokens as opposed to passwords.
Okay, I just want to quickly address a question we had through Twitter from Eli Fetterplace. I hope he's here. I hope he waited. Francois, we sort of talked about this a little bit earlier. So he replied to the tweet, inviting people to come to the Tech Talk, and he said, "What are some alternatives for managing discovery and metering of existing undocumented consumers of data services?" So I'm not sure if you wanted to address that, or I'm not sure if it's exactly around this topic, but I'll let you give us your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that was meant for this particular topic today, but maybe if it was and you are live on the event, feel free to provide more information. Use the hashtag Layer7Live, and Stephen will pick up any further comments you have on that.
Great. Okay, and then I'm going to go straight to the 2 email questions that we'd had. I'm not going to say the full name, so I'm just going to call you VJ. Hopefully you're on the line. Are there any architectural enhancements provided by Layer 7, by the Layer 7 appliance or solution to prevent phishing and other recently reported attacks? We sort of talked about that. Are there preferred deployment approaches for banks and financial institutions specifically, since security obviously is critical?
Yeah, so I would say security should always be critical, right? If you're going to go through the trouble of authenticating users, you should do it in a way that's secure. So, to address the first part of the question, like I said, by default, we implement strict redirection to URI validation, right? And I know that very often people, developers demand that, you should, I just want to register, the beginning of the URI, and I want to be able to append anything I want at the end, because that makes it easier for me as an app developer to add some state, and there is a state parameter as part of the OAuth specification, so that you should use that. So yeah, we enforce strict redirect URI validation for all of the redirect-based handshakes. We support both confidential and public clients. We have this decoupled API token management layer that makes it easier to integrate in a more complex OAuth implementation. So that allows you to have, for example, tokens that are managed within a secured layer and having edge endpoints that implement the OAuth protocol. So from an architectural perspective, I think that's a great pattern.
We did get one through Twitter just now, or recently, from Brian.
Is that from Brain 760?
No, Brain 760. Are there any RFC efforts ongoing to make OAuth 2 more secure on third-party mobile applications?
On third-party mobile applications, I don't think there's necessarily a magical solution here, but there's some good recommendations, right? Like I said earlier, when you're dealing with public clients, and I think we need to be prepared for that. You should be prepared to deal with public clients because you can't always rely on the possibility that there's going to be you're going to be dealing with confidential clients only. So having always the user context validated and the consent expressed as far as a handshake is a precaution that I want to make sure is expressed here. I think that's pretty much essential to dealing with public clients. As far as the RFC efforts, So like I said in the intro, there's a couple of RFCs that are, well, first there's the security consideration section from the OAuth spec, but there's another RFC that I find interesting right now, 6819, which is not, strictly looking at this from a mobile perspective, but just security considerations, called threat model and security considerations. So I think good reference as well.
Great. Okay, and like I said, there's a sort of a side conversation going on between a few people in the live stream chat, and they mentioned RFC 6819 as well. So I'm going to go back to another email question. We're getting sort of towards the end, so if you do have some final questions, try to get them in the chat or with the hashtag Layer7Live in the next minute or so, and we'll try to answer them the best we can. We also forgot to mention that if we do answer a question, answer one of your questions, and a few of you have asked several. So if you send us your details, your address, your mailing address, and your size to techtalk@layer7.com, we can send you one of our nice API t-shirts that Jose here designed. Here's one style.
Yeah, you can see the icons.
It depends on the size, what your size is, which shirt. This is one that's our API Academy, which is another thing. We have an API Design Academy as well at Layer 7. Francois is part of it. So some API related t-shirts. So make sure you send us your size and your mailing address. And if we answered one of your questions, then we'll send you out a t-shirt, maybe some stickers, some other swag. So yeah. I'm just going to answer this ask this email question and try to get to the last few that we got towards the end. So this one comes from Rich Campamar, and I think Rich has been here before, so hopefully you're still on the stream. Have you seen OAuth scopes implemented or enforced in practice? It seems that in some cases, as long as the requested scope is valid, it isn't passed to the resource server for further evaluation.
Yeah. Yes. The scope usually, when it's used, it's agreed upon as part of the handshake, and the resource server has the ability to look up what scope was agreed upon as part of the handshake. That's the way that's implemented with Layer 7. The thing with scope is that remember that it is optional, right? And if you're not involving an end user in a decision, as part of your service, if you're not, for example, with Facebook, I'm going to say, yes, I authorize this application in getting basic information about me, or I can go a level deeper and say, I authorize this application to post on my behalf. Those are different levels of scope that have a very clear meaning to the user, and you're involving the user in making that decision. If you don't have that concept as part of your service, maybe you don't need to use scope, right? The authorization decision that you make at runtime can just be based on the identity of a user, of an application, and any identity attributes that you have around those identities. So you don't always need to use scope, is what I would say.
Okay. I think this is probably going to be the last question from Ravi. Most of the OAuth implementations from Facebook and LinkedIn, etc., are different. How do you enforce them to follow vendor security reviews?
Yeah, I feel your pain, Ravi, because I like I said, the most basic thing where you enforce a redirect URI seems to have been omitted in some pretty big OAuth providers, and I don't understand how that came to be. I think it's outrageous. How do you force a service provider in following security? I think you should demand it. If you're going to partner with a service provider, you should demand that they implement things like OAuth in a secure way. I don't know that I can point to a channel, a particular channel through which you can enforce that third-party vendor do that. But you should definitely pay attention to it, and if you're going to implement that yourself, you should also take great care in making sure that you're looking at the different security considerations that are recommended, and we'd love to help you. So come see Layer 7, and we have all of that figured out for you.
Okay. So Francois, you really are on the hot seat today. Lots of questions.
Wow.
Thinking on your feet. We've got one more. Do you feel like answering one more question before we say thanks very much?
Yes, more questions.
Okay. Here's another one from T. LaFam, or whatever your name is. I'm sorry. It's TLE Fam. Can you comment on the bearer token and the holder of the key token? Seems like HOK is the best, but I'm not sure I understand why there is a need to have this token.
Yeah, so holder of key versus bearer, that's not usually something that, I usually talk about this in the context of SAML, but I guess you could have, something similar with OAuth if you're signing requests, for example, with HMAX. Maybe you're talking about the bearer versus the code token type. So bearer seems to be the way that everyone is going towards right now. The OAuth 2 specification code token type does not seem to have any traction, and I think that's putting it nicely. I think it's pretty much dead, right? So yeah, if you're using a secure channel, I think using a bearer token is appropriate, and a lot of the initial motivation in supporting an HMAX signature as part of OAuth 1 was because people wanted to be able to use OAuth without using SSL, and I think you should use SSL anyway. So bearer token, I think, is easier to support, combined with SSL, at least as secure, if not more, and it reduces a lot of potential intra-op issues when you're dealing with all these different providers.
Okay, I think we're going to say thanks to everybody for joining us. We hope you got your question asked or answered. You asked your question and it was answered. Thanks so much to Francois. I know the questions were coming on fast and furious, hard and heavy. So great job. Thanks so much, and thank everybody who participated and asked your questions. It's a really interesting topic, and we appreciate it. So don't forget, the email is techtalk@layer7.com. If you send us your mailing address and the size, we'll send you a API t-shirt. And we'll probably be back towards the end of October. I think we're going to have Mike and Ronnie, two of the members of the API Academy, talking about API design. So stay tuned, to the Layer 7 Twitter stream. Check us out on social media. Our @handle for Twitter, if you guys are interested, is just @Layer7. Facebook as well is just facebook.com/Layer7. All our upcoming events, where we are, what we're doing, new product releases, all the interesting things that are happening here at Layer 7, you can find on our Twitter and Facebook, all our social media, the website. So thanks again very much. And Francois, thank you. Always great to talk to you. And we'll see you guys next time. Thanks very much.
See you guys.